"Sir, the caller says a man is breaking into her cabin right now." That was the first thing I heard crackling through the deputy's radio as I stepped out of my truck, gravel crunching under my boots in the quiet of the pine woods. The morning air smelled like cold water and sap, the kind of clean mountain air you only find miles away from city noise. My cabin sat 50 yards ahead, tucked beside Silver Creek, where the water curved through the valley like a ribbon of glass. I'd grown up here, learned to fish off that same wooden dock, learned to split firewood behind the shed my father built with his own hands back in 1974. And yet standing there on my own land, watching two patrol cars roll slowly up the dirt road, you'd think I was the one trespassing. A woman's voice cut through the stillness before the engines even shut off. "That's him. That's the man I told you about." She stepped forward from the porch of my cabin like she owned the place, one manicured finger pointed straight at my chest. "Margaret Holloway, president of the Silver Creek Retreat Homeowners Association. Perfect blonde hair, white tennis sweater, and the kind of tight smile that usually means trouble is about to follow." I'd seen that smile twice before this week. Once when she planted a bright metal sign at the edge of my property that read Private HOA Community Property in bold red letters. And once when she tried to hand me a violation notice for a cabin that had been standing there longer than most of the houses in her resort development. "Officer," she said loudly as the first deputy stepped out of his cruiser, "this man is breaking into my cabin. I want him removed immediately." The deputy glanced from her to me, confusion flickering across his face for half a second. I leaned against the hood of my truck and watched the whole scene unfold like I was watching a play I'd already read the ending to. The creek murmured behind the trees. A woodpecker tapped somewhere high in the branches. Margaret crossed her arms, clearly pleased with herself, as if the flashing patrol lights meant she'd already won. "I told him yesterday," she continued, voice dripping with that sweet HOA authority. "This property now falls under our association jurisdiction." But he refused to leave. The deputy shifted his weight and adjusted the radio on his shoulder. Another cruiser door slammed shut behind him as the second officer walked up the gravel path. Margaret took a step closer to them, lowering her voice like she was sharing a secret. "People like him think they can ignore the rules." She glanced at me again, smug. "But not in my community." I rubbed a thumb across the worn metal edge of the key in my hand, the same key that had opened the cabin door for nearly 40 years. My father used to keep it on a nail beside the kitchen window. I could still picture the place exactly the way it looked when I was a kid. The old stone fireplace, the creak of the pine floorboards, the lake wind rattling the screen door every fall. Margaret didn't know any of that history. To her, this valley was just another extension of the luxury vacation homes she'd been selling up the road. Another line on a property map. Another rule to enforce. The deputy cleared his throat and finally spoke. "Ma'am, you said this man is trespassing?" Margaret nodded quickly. "Yes, that's exactly what I said." The deputy looked over at me again, and that's when his eyebrows lifted slightly, like a man who had just realized the situation was a lot more complicated than the caller expected. Because Margaret Holloway had no idea who she'd just called the police on. And she definitely had no idea whose badge was sitting in the glove compartment of the truck beside me. The deputy's eyes lingered on me for another second, the kind of pause that only happens when someone recognizes a face, but does not immediately say it out loud. Margaret Holloway did not notice. She was too busy enjoying the moment. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the windows of my cabin, while she stood on the porch like she had just won a courtroom case. Silver Creek Valley was quiet except for the murmur of the creek and the low idle of the patrol engines. Morning sunlight filtered through the tall pine trees, casting long shadows across the dirt road that led down to the water. I had driven that road more times than I could count over the past 35 years. My father cut the original path through those trees with a chainsaw and a borrowed bulldozer in the summer of 1974. Back then this whole valley was nothing but forest, 2 cattle pastures, and a narrow fishing trail along the creek. The cabin was the first structure for miles. My father built it with rough cedar beams and river stone from the bank behind the property. I learned how to swing a hammer on that porch. I learned how to tie a fishing knot sitting on the dock that still stretched 20 feet into the water. Every board inside that cabin held some memory of a quiet weekend, a family dinner, or a long afternoon of fixing something that did not really need fixing. Margaret Holloway had moved into the valley 6 months ago. She arrived the way developers always arrive, in a white sport utility vehicle with brochures, survey maps, and the promise of turning untouched land into a luxury destination. Silver Creek Retreat went up fast. New roads cut through the forest. 10 vacation homes appeared in less than a year. Then came the clubhouse, the gate, and the homeowners association that suddenly believed it owned the entire valley. At first the notices were small things. A letter about unauthorized structures. A request to register with the association office. A suggestion that my cabin did not match the approved architectural style of the community. I ignored the letters. The cabin had been standing there nearly 5 decades before Margaret Holloway decided the mountains needed rules. Last week she drove down this same dirt road in that white vehicle and stepped out holding a clipboard like she was inspecting a hotel property. She walked the length of my dock, glanced at the firewood stacked beside the shed, and finally informed me that my cabin now fell inside the boundaries of the Silver Creek Retreat Homeowners Association. I remember the exact way she said it. Calm, confident, like it was simply a fact everyone should accept. When I told her this land had been in my family since before the highway was built 20 miles away, her smile tightened the same way it was tightening now. The deputies shifted again beside the cruiser, clearly weighing how to handle the situation. Margaret pointed toward the cabin door where the old brass lock still hung exactly where it had always been. She spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. This property belongs to the association now. He refuses to leave. The deputy looked at me one more time, and I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. Because Margaret Holloway had spent the last 10 minutes explaining why the police needed to remove a trespasser. The only problem was that the man she wanted removed happened to be the one who signed every patrol schedule in this county. The deputy finally cleared his throat and spoke carefully, the way officers do when they are trying to keep a situation calm before it turns awkward. He looked at Margaret first, then back at me, then down at the gravel for a second like he was choosing the safest sentence possible. Margaret, however, had no patience for hesitation. She took 2 confident steps down from the porch, the wooden boards creaking beneath her spotless white sneakers, and gestured toward the cabin door like a real estate agent presenting a listing. This structure falls inside Silver Creek Retreat property lines now. Our survey confirmed it last month. She lifted the clipboard tucked under her arm and flipped a page with theatrical precision. We notified him twice. He ignored both letters. Her voice carried the smooth certainty of someone who had repeated the same argument many times in board meetings and community gatherings. The problem was that Margaret Holloway believed rules were the same thing as ownership. She had arrived in the valley with the confidence of someone who had spent years running neighborhood associations in suburbs where every mailbox matched and every lawn followed the same schedule for mowing. Silver Creek Valley did not work like that. The mountains did not care about architectural guidelines or homeowners association fees. The creek had been running through this canyon long before anyone thought about building vacation homes here. Margaret pointed again, more firmly this time. Officer, I would like him escorted off the property. The deputy shifted his hat slightly and glanced toward the second officer standing beside the other cruiser. That younger officer had just finished looking at the license plate on my truck. He looked back toward us and gave the smallest nod I had ever seen, the kind of silent signal that travels between deputies when they realize something about the situation that the caller does not. Margaret noticed the exchange and mistook it for agreement. Her smile widened. You see, she continued, this is exactly why we established proper community oversight. Without rules, people simply do whatever they want with land. She waved her clipboard toward the forest behind the cabin where tall pine trees stretched up the mountainside. That land was recently acquired by the development group that partners with our association. The entire valley is being organized under one master community plan. I leaned my shoulder against the side of my truck and watched the sunlight flicker across the hood through the branches above. Margaret had repeated that speech almost word for word the last time she stood on this same patch of dirt. That was 3 days earlier, when she first tried to explain why a 50-year-old family cabin suddenly needed permission from an association that had existed less than a year. She had arrived with a rolled survey map that morning. I could still picture the way she spread it across the hood of her vehicle and traced a bright red line around the valley. According to that map, the boundary of Silver Creek Retreat wrapped around nearly 300 acres of forest. My cabin sat right in the center of the red circle. I remember asking one simple question that day. Who signed the paperwork transferring the land? Margaret did not like that question. She simply tapped the map again and said the development company had secured everything legally. Now she stood here again with 2 patrol cars and a clipboard, convinced she had finally cornered the stubborn stranger who refused to follow her rules. The deputy took a slow breath and finally looked directly at me. His voice stayed polite, but there was something careful behind it now. Sir, can you explain your connection to this property? The question hung in the cool mountain air for a moment. Sir, can you explain your connection to this property? The deputy kept his tone neutral, but his eyes stayed on me with the quiet patience of someone who already suspected the answer. Margaret stepped forward before I could even open my mouth. He does not have one, she said quickly, cutting across the silence. That is exactly the problem. He appeared here several weeks ago and refuses to acknowledge the authority of the Silver Creek Retreat Homeowners Association. She held up the clipboard again like it was official evidence. Our development group purchased the surrounding land from the previous timber company. Everything inside those boundaries is now subject to our community regulations. The deputy listened without interrupting. The younger officer near the cruiser crossed his arms and leaned lightly against the door, watching the exchange with the calm curiosity of someone who knew the valley better than the caller standing in front of him. I let Margaret finish her explanation. She described the survey map again. She described the development company again. She even mentioned the gate they planned to install 2 miles down the access road to control traffic into the valley. By the time she finished, the creek was still running quietly behind the trees and the wind had begun to move gently through the pine branches overhead. I reached into the back pocket of my jeans and pulled out the folded piece of paper I had been carrying since the day my father handed it to me nearly 20 years earlier. The edges were worn soft from time. The ink stamp from the county office had faded slightly, but the words were still perfectly readable. I held it loosely in one hand while the deputy watched. My connection to the property is fairly simple, I said calmly. My family purchased this land in 1973. My father built the cabin the following summer with a county permit and a construction record filed at the Pine Ridge Courthouse. Margaret made a small sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a scoff. That is not possible. She shook her head with the confidence of someone who believed paperwork always supported her position. The development company verified every acre before we started the community project. I nodded slowly. I am sure they believe they did. The deputy extended his hand slightly. May I see that document, sir? I stepped forward and placed the folded paper into his palm. He opened it carefully, smoothing the crease with his thumb as his eyes moved across the faded county seal at the top of the page. Margaret leaned closer to read over his shoulder, her expression tightening as the silence stretched another few seconds longer. The younger officer pushed himself away from the cruiser and walked a few steps closer. The deputy finally looked up from the paper and glanced at the cabin, then at the creek, then back at me. Margaret crossed her arms again. Well, she sounded impatient now. That paper does not change the fact that this property is part of our association boundary. The deputy exhaled slowly and folded the document again before handing it back to me. Ma'am, he said carefully, this appears to be a recorded land deed from the Pine Ridge County Clerk Office dated June 17, 1973. Margaret blinked once, clearly annoyed that the conversation was not moving the way she expected. She straightened her shoulders and spoke with renewed confidence. Then the development company must have acquired it afterward. That is the only explanation. The deputy looked at me again, and there was the faintest hint of a smile in the corner of his mouth now, the kind of expression that appears when someone realizes a misunderstanding is about to become very clear. Because Margaret Holloway had just spent the last 15 minutes arguing ownership of a piece of land whose official record sat in the hands of the very person she wanted removed from it. Margaret stared at the folded deed in my hand like it was an inconvenient detail that had no right to exist. The wind shifted through the trees again, carrying the faint smell of pine needles and cold creek water across the clearing. The deputy rested his hands on his duty belt and looked from Margaret to the cabin and then back toward the dirt road where the patrol cars were parked. For a moment nobody spoke. Margaret was the first to break the silence. That document does not prove anything about the association boundaries, she said sharply. Land ownership and community jurisdiction are 2 different things. The development company secured authority over this entire valley through a master development agreement. Her voice had grown firmer again, the confidence returning as she leaned into the argument she had clearly rehearsed. Every property owner inside that agreement must comply with the association rules. The younger deputy glanced toward me and then toward the cabin again. His eyes lingered on the old cedar beams and the stone chimney that rose from the roof like it had grown out of the mountain itself. He had probably driven past this place dozens of times over the years. People who grew up around Pine Ridge knew this cabin long before anyone ever said the words Silver Creek Retreat. Margaret stepped closer to the porch and tapped the railing with her pen. Regardless of when it was built, she continued, the land surrounding it now belongs to the development company. Access roads, creek frontage, recreational zones. All of it is part of the community design. She pointed toward the water behind the cabin where the wooden dock extended 20 feet into the slow-moving creek. That dock alone violates our environmental setback requirements. The deputy raised one eyebrow slightly. Environmental setback requirements, he repeated carefully. Yes, Margaret said quickly. Our association enforces modern standards for responsible land use. She flipped through the papers on her clipboard and pulled out a glossy map printed in bright colors. According to this survey, she said while unfolding it, the association boundary runs directly along the creek bank and includes everything within 300 yards of the water. She laid the map across the hood of my truck as if presenting final proof. The red line curved neatly around the valley and passed directly over the roof of the cabin. There it is, she said, tapping the paper with her pen. That cabin sits right here inside the community zone. The deputy leaned slightly forward and studied the map. The younger officer walked over as well, folding his arms while he looked down at the bright red boundary line. Margaret stood tall beside them, clearly convinced the visual evidence had settled the matter. I let them study the map for a few seconds before I spoke again. That survey is missing one important detail, I said. Margaret did not even look up. What detail would that be? I pointed past the edge of the hood toward the creek and the long stretch of forest climbing the opposite hillside. The property line from the original county deed does not stop at the cabin. It continues across the creek and runs another 600 yards up that ridge. Margaret finally lifted her eyes from the map. The deputy looked from the paper to the land behind us, quietly measuring the distance with the practiced instinct of someone who had spent years patrolling the valley roads. The younger officer let out a slow breath. Margaret blinked once, then again, as the realization began to creep slowly into her expression. Because if the deed extended beyond the creek the way I had just described, then the red boundary line on her survey map was sitting on land that had never belonged to the development company in the first place. Margaret stared at the hillside beyond the creek as if the trees themselves had just contradicted her. The wind moved through the branches with a soft rushing sound that filled the silence between us. For the first time since the patrol cars arrived, her confidence faltered. That is not correct, she said slowly, though her voice carried less certainty than before. The development survey clearly establishes the association boundary along the creek bank. The deputy did not respond right away. Instead, he turned slightly and looked across the water toward the slope of the ridge where tall pines rose in uneven rows along the mountain. Anyone who had spent time in Pine Ridge County could recognize the old survey markers if they knew where to look. Faded orange paint still marked a few trunks near the lower edge of the hillside, remnants of the original timber company survey from decades earlier. I pointed toward one of those trees standing about 40 yards past the creek. See that marker, I said. My father showed it to me when I was 12 years old. It marks the eastern corner of the Carter property line. Margaret followed my finger, squinting slightly in the morning light. The younger deputy stepped closer to the creek bank and studied the same tree. I remember that line, he said quietly to his partner. The old timber boundary used to run all the way up that ridge before the company sold the southern acreage. The deputy beside my truck nodded slowly as the pieces began to settle into place. Margaret shifted her weight, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was moving. The development company assured our board that every parcel inside the retreat boundary was properly acquired, she insisted. She tapped the map again with her pen as if the bright red line could somehow override the land itself. The deputy glanced down at the paper and then back toward the hillside. Sometimes maps leave out older deeds, he said evenly, especially when the land has been in private hands for a long time. Margaret folded her arms tightly across her chest. That land has been part of the development plan since last year. The company would not have built roads and homes here without verifying the ownership first. I leaned slightly against the truck and watched the sunlight ripple across the water behind the dock. Development companies rely on surveys, I said calmly. Surveys rely on the documents they are given. If one deed never made it into their records, the map ends up wrong. The younger deputy looked again at the cabin, then at the creek, and finally back at Margaret. Ma'am, he said gently, if the original Carter deed extends across the creek and up that ridge, the association survey would be overlapping private property. Margaret blinked twice, the words clearly sinking in. That is impossible, she said, though the firmness had completely drained from her voice now. The deputy rested one hand on the edge of the truck hood and looked directly at her. It is actually more common than people think when large developments expand quickly. Margaret's gaze drifted from the map to the cabin again. The old cedar structure stood exactly where it had for half a century, its weathered boards glowing softly in the morning sun. The creek flowed behind it just as quietly as it always had. For the first time since she arrived in the valley, Margaret Holloway was beginning to realize that the neat red line on her association map might have been drawn across land that was never part of her community at all. Margaret stood very still beside the hood of my truck, the glossy survey map fluttering slightly in the breeze. The red boundary line that had looked so confident a few minutes earlier now seemed a lot less certain spread across the metal under the morning sun. The deputy beside me watched her carefully, the way an officer watches someone who is slowly realizing that the situation has shifted beneath their feet. The younger deputy had walked a few steps closer to the creek and was still studying the faded orange survey mark on the pine tree across the water. He pointed toward it with his chin. That marker has been there a long time, he said quietly. I remember seeing it when the county repaired the Forest Service road 5 years ago. Margaret did not answer right away. She stared at the tree like she was trying to will the paint mark to disappear. That marker could belong to the timber company boundary, she said finally. That does not necessarily mean this. Property extends beyond the creek. The deputy beside the truck gave a slow nod. That is possible, he said. But the deed he showed us lists the eastern boundary running 600 yards up the ridge line. That would place the survey marker almost exactly where he described. Margaret turned back toward the map again, flipping through the pages on her clipboard as if another sheet of paper might rescue the argument. The quiet sound of the creek filled the pause between her movements. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. It was tighter now, more careful. Even if that deed exists, she said, the development company still obtained rights to the surrounding parcels. Our association manages the access road and recreational areas across this valley. She gestured toward the dirt road behind the patrol cars where the tire tracks curved through the trees. That road is maintained by the community. Everyone using it is required to comply with the association regulations. The younger deputy stepped away from the creek bank and looked back toward us. Actually, that road has been listed as a county access easement since 1998, he said. The county keeps it open so residents further up the valley can reach the highway. Margaret blinked again, the confidence draining another notch. She looked from him to the other deputy and then to me. That cannot be correct, she said quietly. The development company told our board they controlled the road access when the retreat was built. The deputy beside the truck straightened slightly and folded his arms. Development companies say a lot of things when they are selling property, he replied evenly. What matters is what is recorded at the courthouse. Margaret's eyes moved slowly across the valley again. The cabin stood quietly between the tall trees, the dock stretching over the creek exactly as it had for decades. The red boundary line on her survey map no longer matched the land she was standing on. The younger deputy glanced at me again with the faintest hint of a smile. Margaret followed his gaze and studied my face more carefully than she had before. Something in her expression shifted then, a flicker of recognition trying to surface through the confusion. She frowned slightly and tilted her head. Wait a moment, she said slowly. You look familiar. The deputy beside the truck exhaled softly, almost like he had been expecting that realization to arrive sooner or later. Margaret took another step closer, narrowing her eyes as she searched her memory. I have seen you somewhere before, she said. Perhaps at the county office or a council meeting. I did not answer right away. I simply reached into the open door of my truck and pulled out the small leather badge wallet resting on the center console, turning it once in my hand while the morning sunlight reflected across the metal star inside. Margaret watched my hand as I opened the leather badge wallet, the metal star catching the sunlight for just a moment before I turned it outward. The valley was completely quiet except for the slow water of the creek behind the cabin. For a second nobody said anything. The younger deputy shifted his weight beside the cruiser and looked away toward the trees, clearly trying not to smile. The other deputy kept his posture calm and professional, but the corner of his mouth lifted slightly as he glanced at the badge. Margaret leaned forward a little, squinting at the polished metal. The realization did not hit all at once. It arrived in pieces, the way a puzzle falls together when someone finally sees the picture. Her confident expression tightened, then froze. The clipboard slipped a few inches lower in her hand. "Sheriff," she said slowly, almost like she was testing the word before believing it. I closed the badge wallet and rested it on the hood of the truck. The morning sunlight had climbed higher now, shining across the clearing and lighting the roof of the old cabin with that warm mountain glow that always appears around mid-morning. "Yes, ma'am," I said calmly. "Pine Ridge County Sheriff's Office." Margaret blinked again and glanced quickly at the deputies beside the patrol cars, as if expecting one of them to correct the situation. Neither of them spoke. The younger deputy cleared his throat and shifted his hat slightly. "Morning, Sheriff," he said with an easy nod that carried just enough respect to make the situation perfectly clear. Margaret's shoulders dropped an inch. The map on the truck hood fluttered again in the breeze, the red boundary line still stretched boldly across the paper. A few seconds earlier she had been using that map to prove I was trespassing on her community property. Now she was staring at the same piece of paper like it had betrayed her. I was not aware," she said carefully. Her voice sounded very different now, the smooth authority replaced by something more cautious. "I understand," I replied. "Most people assume the man standing in old work boots beside a creek is just another local resident." The deputy beside me gave a quiet chuckle that he quickly disguised by adjusting the radio on his shoulder. Margaret glanced toward the cabin again, then toward the creek, then finally back to the badge wallet on the hood. The pieces of the morning were settling into a very different picture than the one she had expected when she dialed 911. The red line on her association survey was wrong. The deed placed the land inside my family property. The road she claimed the association controlled was a county easement. And now the man she had asked the police to remove from the property happened to be the one who supervised the entire department standing in front of her. She drew a slow breath and straightened the collar of her white sweater, clearly searching for a way to recover the authority she had walked in with. "Sheriff," she began again, trying to sound composed. "Perhaps there has simply been a misunderstanding about the property boundaries. That happens sometimes when developments expand quickly." I nodded slightly. "It does happen." The deputies both watched quietly as the wind moved through the pine trees again. Margaret looked down at the map one more time and then folded it slowly across the center line, the bright red boundary disappearing as the paper bent. Because at that moment she finally understood that the person she had tried to remove from the valley was the very same person responsible for enforcing the law across every road, cabin, and property line in Pine Ridge County. Margaret finished folding the survey map and held it against her clipboard like she was trying to hide the bright red line that had caused the entire misunderstanding. The wind moved gently through the pine trees again and carried the faint sound of the creek flowing past the dock behind the cabin. For a long moment, she simply stood there, looking from the cabin to the deputies and finally back toward me. The valley had gone quiet again now that the argument had run out of momentum. Even the patrol engines sounded softer against the background of the forest. I picked up the badge wallet from the hood of the truck and slipped it back into the open door beside the driver's seat. Margaret cleared her throat, clearly trying to rebuild some sense of control over the situation she had started. "Sheriff," she said carefully, "I believe this entire situation may have been the result of inaccurate information from the development company." Her voice was much calmer now, the sharp authority gone, and replaced with the cautious tone people use when they realize they might have stepped into territory they do not fully understand. I nodded once. That happens more often than people expect when large projects move quickly. The deputy beside me glanced toward the road and then back at Margaret. "Ma'am," he said politely, "property disputes like this are usually settled through the county clerk records or a land survey review. Calling emergency services is generally not necessary unless there is an immediate safety concern." Margaret gave a quick nod as if she had just remembered that she was the one who had called 911 in the first place. "Yes, of course," she said. "I simply believed someone had entered a property that belonged to the association." The younger deputy leaned lightly against the cruiser again and watched the scene with relaxed curiosity. The tension that had filled the clearing earlier had mostly drifted away with the morning breeze. Margaret adjusted the strap of her clipboard and looked toward the cabin one more time. The old cedar walls caught the sunlight through the trees, and the dock stretched quietly over the water exactly the way it had since my father built it decades ago. "I suppose the association will need to review the property boundaries again," she said slowly. "I imagine that would be a good idea," I replied. "The development company might want to confirm their surveys with the county records before drawing new maps." Margaret nodded again, though the gesture carried a hint of embarrassment now. She stepped back from the truck hood and glanced at the deputies. "Thank you, officers," she said. "I appreciate you coming out this morning." The deputy beside me gave a short nod in return. "That is what we are here for." Margaret turned toward the dirt road and walked slowly back toward her vehicle parked further up the access trail. The sound of her footsteps faded into the quiet of the valley. The younger deputy waited until she was several yards away before letting out a quiet breath that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. The other deputy looked at me and shook his head with a faint smile. "Interesting morning call, Sheriff." I watched Margaret's car disappear between the trees and listened to the creek flowing past the cabin once more. The valley looked exactly the same as it had when I arrived that morning. Same cabin, same dock, same stretch of forest climbing the ridge beyond the water. The only real difference was that one very confident homeowners association president had just learned an important lesson about property lines and county records. Because around Pine Ridge, authority is not decided by a clipboard or a bright red line on a map. It is decided by the deeds filed at the courthouse and the quiet truth written into the land itself.